All right, now we're at the symposium with Mr. Sam Falvo, and he's the state director of New York. You know, have you come down to Florida before?
Well, I've been to Florida one time before when I was graduated high school, and I was enlisted in the Navy into the nuclear power program. So Florida was my last free summer blowout. I haven't been here since. So the MUFON, oh yes. There's still maybe wanted posters around. I don't know. But the Mufon Symposium definitely has brought me down, and as state director, it's not just New York City, but we're the whole statewide keeps one pretty busy at most times.
Now, being a state director of New York, is there a lot of sightings that you research in New York? Because I mean, New York, of course, is a hotbed for a lot of activity, a lot of things. How hotbed is it for when it comes to ufology? When it comes to the reports of people seeing unidentified objects or abductions, for example? I mean, there's a lot of reports out of New York, but what's been the amount of numbers you've seen?
Well, as a general rule, we see anywhere from 15 to 20 to 30 reports a month, and most places don't see that in a year. I've got a terrific chief investigator by the name of Nick Vulgaris, who filters almost everything for me, and he's the guy who really runs the show. And he has the charge that when reports come in from people who report to MUFON, he disseminates those reports to our field investigators. And I've got a cadre of maybe 18 or so field investigators scattered throughout the state. And those are the folks that do the boots on the ground stuff and the investigations and that kind of a thing. So it's definitely a work in progress as far as trying to coordinate everything and give the people the freedom that they need, to do the work. So it's quite a lot of fun and quite a lot of work at the same time.
Have you invested in MUFON itself? How long have you been working with MUFON?
That's a hard question. I even forgot. I'll bet you I've been with MUFON probably 10, 12 years and state director for at least 6 or 8 of them. Names, dates, and places I don't, keep track of too much. I tell my wife that's why I got married, to keep track of everybody's birthday and anniversary. But it's got to be at least around that long. So if I want a definitive answer, I'd have to ask her.
So what got you involved? Have you had sightings yourself? Are you just interested in the topic, or are you a skeptic who's just trying to make sense out of it all?
Well, I wish I could say I've seen one, but I never have. But I was always interested in space from when I was a kid. Remember, I grew up with the astronauts in the 1950s and 60s. So space was always there. Again, when I mentioned I went into the Navy, I was involved in the nuclear power program. So nuclear engineering and reactors and ultimate propulsion systems still drive me. So when I see a UFO and everybody says, what would you do if you ever got abducted? I say I'd make a deal with them that they could perform any scientific experiment on me that they wanted, so long as they took me on a tour of the engine room. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I'm a nuts and bolts kind of guy. I'm not too much into the esoteric stuff. I have a hard time with it, but I have an open mind about it. There's far more people involved in various aspects of it. But that's really what got me started. I think it's a childhood interest. And then upon getting out of the service, I realized that there's a lot of good people out there who are seeing many different things, and they're not just making these stories up. And the more I get involved with MUFON and I hear a lot of the cases that come through, there's just things that happen that just people wouldn't even think of, So I think it's a real phenomenon, but one that certainly needs to be studied to be understood.
And studied at a scientific level, not just at a TV show or regular researchers, but at a more scientifically ground level, especially the abduction phenomenon.
Definitely, without a doubt. I've had a couple of cases that involved abductions that have no real good explanation other than the fact that it seems to be too real to be true. I've had one gentleman come to me in his late 40s, early 50s, and he started telling me a story about himself when he was like 5. So right away, I had this red flag come up, I was like, who remembers what they were doing when they were 5, So he recalls being in his backyard playing, and he saw this red sphere, and he heard his name called. So a little while later, he remembers walking into the kitchen, back door of the kitchen, and his mom grabs him by the wrist and says, "Where have you been?" and gives him a swat. And so that was the catalyst where he never forgot it, because he says, "I didn't know why my mom hit me." Well, evidently he had been gone for like 4 to 6 hours. She had every relative that she knew out combing the streets looking for this kid. It was a small town, so she had the local gendarme, constable was out looking for him. The volunteer fire department was ready to get called out, and he just comes strolling in the back door. So that was the first thing that he consciously remembers. And then in high school, he and a friend were driving past his local high school, and admittedly, he says, we were looking for chicks, he says. So as they drove past the high school, they looked up, and on the roof was a disc, and it covered the whole roof. There was a small parapet on the roof, so they couldn't really tell if it was sitting on the roof or just hovering above it. But there was a row of windows. He says, and silhouetted in the windows, he says, were 3 or 4 beings. He couldn't, because they were silhouetted, they were dark. He says, but he had the distinct impression that there was a console, and they had their hands on the console, and they were like stretched up on their tiptoes to look down at them. So they had that kind of body English. So, you hear something like that, and you say, well, who would think of that minute detail, if you were making up a story. So the next thing they know, they're standing outside the car. And the thing took off, and when it did, it had such a bright flash of light, it lit up the athletic field behind the school. So the baseball diamond and the soccer courts and all of that were lit right up as this thing took off. Later, as a young adult in his early 30s, he's shaving, getting ready to go to work, and he gets a bloody nose. And out of his right nostril, a BB comes out of his nose. So he looked at it. He didn't think anything of it because as a machinist, he thought it was a piece of metal, and you know how the body sometimes will coat. So he just wadded it up in toilet paper and threw it down the toilet. And my stomach turned because there goes the evidence, So years later, his 16-year-old son comes to him and says, "Dad," he says, "I had a bloody nose this morning and a BB came out of my nose." That was the catalyst that brought him out to me to start telling the story. He says, "I didn't mind too much when they were fooling around with me, but when they're fooling around with my son," he says, "I want to draw the line. What can you do to stop it?" And I just looked at him blankly and shrugged my shoulders. What can I do to stop it? There's nothing you can do.
That follows the common thread we were talking about earlier with other guests, where it seems like it's a lineage thing, where it follows from the father to the son or the mother to the daughter, relatives. It's in the family, and they follow you along not only once, but maybe multiple times in your life to kind of see a progression, almost like if you're tagged, and they just keep following you like we do with animals in the wild. Same kind of scenario. Well, which to an advanced civilization, we would be animals in the wild. That's what we are.
Quick statement, quick question. Statement being that, I hear you talk about how the UFO, when it flew over the field, it lit up those fields. It makes, we've been talking to a lot of people from MUFON about the evidence and, the kind of technology that you guys are trying to push for so you can investigate better. And it really makes you wish somebody had called you guys immediately so you could have ran out there with some kind of equipment to see if any kind of residue was left over when this thing flew away. Which leads into my second question. Did the kid keep the BB?
The father made the mistake. Let's hope the son didn't make the mistake.
Unfortunately, no. Yeah. Yep. So as far as your comment about physical evidence, I don't know if you heard my presentation in there. I was one of we had a case last year. It ended up being one of the top 6 in the world. So I was invited to comment on it, and I gave my perspective where there was a family having a pool party, and they were all out in the backyard, a bunch of kids, maybe half a dozen kids, and Their property line went out to a line of trees, and beyond the trees was a farmer's field. Through the trees, the kids started seeing these flashes of light. So they thought it was heat lightning. So a couple of them said, well, hey, let's go see if we can see the heat lightning. So they went through the trees, and they come through the other side. As soon as they broke through the trees, they almost ran into a disc. It was that close where the kids had to stop, and they were like, within, I'll say 20 feet, 30 feet of this disc. And the disc was huge. It was like, 30 feet across. And it was hovering right above the top of the grasses. Now, the farmer hadn't plowed that field that year. It was like fallow field. Every 7 years they don't plow or whatever. I'm not a farmer. I'm just, But, so the grass was easily shoulder high. And they watched this thing hover, and there was lights going around it. They did make a nice drawing of it, and we have it in our MUFON files. And as it moved a little bit, a white light came down from the bottom, and it hit the grass, and it depressed the grass. It pushed the grass right down. So this was that white light that they saw flashing through the trees. It had done this in 3 different areas in the farmer's field, and then finally it must have dawned on them what they were seeing. The oldest of them was, at the time, was 17. He panicked. They ran back through the trees. This kid went right through the backyard, screaming something about a UFO, and went into his room and locked the door, and he didn't come out the rest of that evening. And the other kids were babbling about what they had found. So I got the call, and my chief investigator and my field investigator, Joe Flammer, who lives in Long Island, got the call. And where this incident happened, I don't know if you're familiar with Pine Bush or the Hudson Valley sighting. This was right there. So it's 4 hours or so from Long Island to drive up, and it's 4 hours or so for me to drive down. So like right in the middle, the worst possible place for us to investigate. So I called in the next morning from work, and I was able to get down there within 3 days of the actual incident with meters. So first thing we did when I got there is I took a background reading of radiation levels. And this was in the driveway of her home. Her background radiation levels corresponded with my background radiations 4 hours away upstate, so I knew it was a good number. When one of the kids was there who actually took me into the field, I would have never found these depressions because the grass was so high, I couldn't see above the grass to look down into a depression, so it just looked like a flat field to me. But the kid knew where it was, so he took me in there. And when I first got to the edge, the first thing I did was I took another reading because you don't want to go barging into something that may be hazardous. So I established at that point that it wasn't hazardous. So I started stringing a grid line using string. You orient a standard grid line in MUFON with north. And then you go crosswise to make 90-degree angles, so it would be like east-west kind of a thing. And we measured out the area of the depression. It was like 40 feet long by about 30 feet wide, so slightly rectangular. It was not a small depression. And so in those grid lines, we started taking measurements. The radiation levels that I picked up were 6.5 times normal background radiation, only within the circle. If you went 12 feet outside the circle, radiation levels dropped back down to normal. So within that circle, we definitely had an elevated level. Not hazardous, but statistically important. It showed something was there. And it emitted gamma radiation. It did not emit alpha or beta. I tested for both. My meter's capable of reading alpha, which is really tough to do. Then I did an EMF sweep of that area, segment by segment. No results. That was normal. And I had a couple of apps on my phone that did magnetometer readings. Nothing there, which kind of corroborated with the compass, because the compass worked fine. And then magnetic readings, gravitometer, everything was normal except the radiation levels. And so I'm thinking to myself, the kids could have crushed the grass down, but they're not going to get their hands on radioactive material. Okay? Yeah, and here's an even better kicker. If somebody kids notwithstanding, if somebody were to have sprinkled radioactive material on the ground, just in that area, it would be like, I'm going to use talcum powder as an example. It would be a particulate that you sprinkle. So if you walked into that area and you walked back out, exactly, it would be on your shoes, it would be on your socks, you know, from the knees down would be covered. So on our way out, as we exited the field, I made sure of that because I had a kid with me. I wanted to make sure he wasn't going to be, you know, absolutely zero radiation on our persons. So that tells me that the ground and the materials within that circle itself were hot. It was not that they were coated with a radioactive substance. Okay, now this is where some science comes from this. In my nuclear experience in the service, the only thing that can make a non-radioactive material radioactive that I know of is to be immersed into a high stream of neutrons. So, and we've done this commonly in the service where inside the nuclear reactor you've got all the control rods and the fuel cells. Well, there's a few empty cells, you know, for whatever. And they could put a material inside these cells, and then the next time they fire up the reactor, it becomes bombarded with extremely strong neutron streams. And these materials, when they do finally get them back out, become radioactive, and, you know, they try to see if they become brittle, if they become super metals, or, you know, what the reaction would be. But that's really the only way. So that tells me, or it infers, maybe that would be a better thing. I am inferring, along with a few other people who know, that part of the propulsion system of this particular craft was emitting a stream of neutrons out the bottom of this craft, enough to, in close proximity to the ground, to have made the ground slightly radioactive. So that's significant. At least it gives a little hint on maybe what the propulsion system is.
It also goes along with the crop circle phenomenon.
Able to get a bird's eye view of the field at all?
No. However, in my interpretation, it was not a crop circle. There was no swirling pattern, okay, and the edges were actually getting pretty rough. And what I noticed to the kid, you know, it didn't look clean. He says, well, some of the grasses and stuff have already started to right themselves. And I took that as significant. When I got down in there afterwards and started taking samples, the material, the grasses, were not broken. They weren't bent over and broken like somebody would with a 2x4 and tramped them through. They actually were leaned over. So I thought that was pretty important. So it was not a man-made crop circle. Something happened that was unusual.
Crop circles has always puzzled the heck out of me. And you see so many elaborate crop circles. It is easy to, not easy, but it is able to be made by men. But I think, you know, when you find radiation traces, that's where the real legit crop circles come in hand. And there's a lot of studies now being done to these crop circles where they're finding more and more of them to have traces of radiation. And that's something that they're finding on a lot of the big ones. Like the Arecibo one that came out a few years ago. The Arecibo crop circle. Are you familiar with that one?
Not that particular one. When you hear Arecibo, to me it means like the radio telescope in Puerto Rico.
The Arecibo message that we sent out in the 70s? Yeah, the one that shows the DNA graph of the human to star system, everything. I mean, they found radiation traces on that as well, including the face that was found in the same field, not far apart from it. Radiation traces were found on there. And that is a very legit reply to something we sent out into space. I mean, that looks to me as, first of all, it looks almost impossible to be made by men because it's so complex, especially something overnight. I don't buy that at all. You have to have at least 80 people out there working overnight, and then there's radiation traces. So I mean, to me, that just it seems like it's too authentic to be faked. But Alan over here had a question for you. Let me go ahead and pass the mic to him.
Well, from your experience, my question is do you think that the neutrons that we're giving off would you say that is their primary propulsion systems in general? And here's the reason I'm asking. Because if normally you see a saucer shape going across that way, if the thrust is coming out from the bottom, what is creating the thrust to make it move in a horizontal fashion?
Well, I don't think the neutrons are thrust. Okay. Well, it's a nuclear technology, perhaps. The neutrons just may be a leakage, a radiation leakage out the bottom of the craft. Whether it's the driving force, I doubt it. I doubt it, because the amount of neutrons it would take to push a vehicle at 5,000 miles an hour would fry anything that was behind it, you know. So I don't think that's the actual thrust, you know. But it may be part of you know, the generation, the power generation that's required to produce that thrust, whatever it is. And so can I determine? No, I've only had one case, so I can't make a generalization on one case.
Is it a possibility that what those kids are is something that we made?
I so want to say no. Okay, probably for a couple of reasons. If it is nuclear by our definition, okay, the reactor I was on, in order to prevent lethal doses, the shielding was like 100 and some odd 28 tons, you know, of concrete, and then another 64 tons of lead. That's not going to lift off the ground and not make any noise. Okay, we just can't do that yet. You know, we can't lift a small aircraft carrier into the air and not make some kind of noise. So yeah, no. The other thing is, if it is a true top secret, ultra, you know, whatever, nobody's supposed to know about it, you're not going to fly this in somebody's backyard. So the government has all the proving grounds that they want out in the middle of the desert. If they were to do something, well, it didn't put them out of business, though. They kept going. So, but to finish the story, I had, after I did my test, and it was hot August day, the lady invited us into the kitchen, and we were talking. She was serving us lemonade and that kind of a thing. She introduced me to her daughter, who was also at the scene with her 2 kids. So when the kids came back screaming, and you know, everybody was getting all excited, it was getting a little dark. So the daughter decided to take her 2 kids home. So on the way, as she left her mother's house, she went around the corner. She could see her mother's backyard from an adjacent road. So she slowed down to look. She says, gee, you know, I wonder if it's still there. She looked up into the field, and she saw something. And it had moved quite a ways away, and what she determined was like 2 orbs. One was red, one was orange, and they were like, if you looked at the face of a clock, it's 7 o'clock and 2 o'clock orientation. See, they were on an angle to each other. And so I was thinking, you know, lights, you know, little pinpoint lights. So I asked her, how big were they? You know, if you put your arm out at you know, full you know, extension, and use your fingers, how big were the objects? She says, well, between an aspirin and a marble was her best guess. So she wasn't seeing tiny lights in the sky. She saw something that had a shape, a physical dimension to it. So I thought that was significant, because not only did I have physical evidence, but now I had corroboration from an adult, and that means a lot.
Samuel, you know, we encourage your continuous participation with MUFON, and you know, it's a lot of fun having you on here on Skywatchers with us and sharing your story with us. And hopefully we could have you on the show as a full hour with us, so we could, you know, dig deeper into your background with MUFON and your continuous work. Is there a website address that you might have that you might want to give out to anybody who's going to watch this later on YouTube or listen to the radio show?
Actually, I don't. I usually, people call me, or they, you know, send my my email, you know, information. So I really don't have a website per se. I can give you my email address if you think that's important. It's SAR FALVO, V as in Victor, at roadrunner.com. Okay.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us and joining Skywatchers for a few minutes here. And it's all out.
year. I've got a terrific chief investigator by the name of Nick Vulgaris, who filters almost everything for me, and he's the guy who really runs the show. And he has the charge that when reports come in from people who report to MUFON, he disseminates those reports to our field investigators. And I've got a cadre of maybe 18 or so field investigators scattered throughout the state. And those are the folks that do the boots on the ground.
All right, now we're at the symposium with Mr. Sam Falvo, and he's the state director of New York. You know, have you come down to Florida before?
Well, I've been to Florida, stuff in the investigations and that kind of a thing. So it's definitely a work in progress as far as trying to coordinate everything and give the people the freedom that they need, you know, to do the work. So it's quite a lot of fun and quite a lot of work at the same time.
Have you invested in MUFON itself? How long have you been working with MUFON?
That's a hard question. I even forgot. You know, I'll bet you I've been with MUFON probably 10, 12 years and state director for at least 6 or 8 of them.
Being a state director of New York, is there a lot of sightings that you research in New York? Because, I mean, New York, of course, is a hotbed for a lot of activity, a lot of things. How hotbed is it for when it comes to ufology, when it comes to the reports of people seeing unidentified objects or abductions, for example? I mean, there's a lot of reports out of New York, but what's been the amount of numbers you've seen?
Well, as a general rule, we see anywhere from 15 to 20 to 30 reports a month. And, most places don't see that. One time before, when I was graduated high school, and I was enlisted in the Navy into the nuclear power program, so Florida was my last free summer blowout. I haven't been here since. So the MUFON, oh yes. There's still maybe wanted posters around, I don't know. But the Mufon Symposium definitely has brought me down. And as state director, it's not just New York City, but the whole statewide keeps one pretty busy at most times.
Now,